During the Second World War, Britain built some of the most legendary aircraft ever to take to the skies. The Spitfire, the Hurricane, the Lancaster, the Mosquito. Even America's famous P-51 Mustang would eventually owe much of its success to British engineering. At first glance, these aircraft couldn't have been more different. Some were sleek fighters, others were massive bombers. One was built almost entirely from wood. Yet hidden beneath their skins was the same beating heart, one engine, built by a company that had no idea it was about to shape the outcome of an entire world war. It would power aircraft over Britain, Germany, North Africa, Italy, Burma, and the Pacific. It became so successful that another nation would build thousands under license simply to meet demand. Historians often debate which fighter won the Battle of Britain, which bomber crippled Germany's industry, which escort fighter helped destroy the Luftwaffe. But behind all of them stood the same masterpiece of engineering. This is the story of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the engine that may have done more to win the Second World War than any other piston engine ever built. In the early 1930s, Britain wasn't preparing for another world war. Like much of Europe, it was still recovering from the devastation of the last one. Military budgets remained tight. Many politicians believed another global conflict was unlikely. Aircraft development slowed, and governments were reluctant to invest heavily in expensive new technologies. Yet inside the headquarters of Rolls-Royce, a very different future was beginning to take shape. The company was already famous around the world. Its luxury automobiles had become symbols of craftsmanship and prestige. But aviation had quietly become just as important. During the First World War, Rolls-Royce had built reliable aircraft engines that earned the trust of pilots and engineers alike. Now, the company wanted to push much further. It wasn't interested in building a slightly better engine. It wanted to build the best aircraft engine in the world. One of the driving forces behind that ambition was Ernest Hives. Unlike many executives, Hives wasn't content with simply managing the company. He understood that technological superiority could determine the outcome of future wars. He encouraged engineers to think beyond existing designs, even when there was no immediate military contract waiting for them. It was a risky strategy. Developing a completely new engine required enormous amounts of time and money. There was no guarantee anyone would buy it. But Hives believed waiting until war arrived would already be too late. Britain needed to prepare before the world realized preparation was necessary. At the time, Rolls-Royce's most successful aircraft engine was the Kestrel. It had earned an excellent reputation during the early 1930s. Reliable, efficient, powerful for its day. Many companies would have continued improving it little by little. Rolls-Royce chose a different path. Its engineers believed the next generation of military aircraft would demand far more power than the Kestrel could ever deliver. Faster airplanes, higher altitudes, heavier weapons, longer ranges. Every new requirement demanded one thing: more horsepower. The challenge was obvious. Producing dramatically more power usually meant building a much larger engine. Larger engines became heavier. Heavier engines reduced aircraft performance. It was a problem every aviation engineer faced. How could you build an engine powerful enough for the future without making the airplane slower? Rather than waiting for government approval, Rolls-Royce quietly began work on a completely new design. Internally, it carried a simple name: PV-12. The letters stood for private venture. That name revealed everything. The British government hadn't requested the engine. It wasn't paying for its development. Rolls-Royce was gambling its own money. If the project failed, the company would absorb the loss. If it succeeded, it could transform military aviation. The engineers designed the PV-12 as a liquid-cooled, 27-litre V12 engine. Compared with many radial engines of the period, Its narrow shape offered a major aerodynamic advantage. Aircraft designers could build slimmer noses. Reduced drag meant higher speeds. The goal wasn't simply to create more horsepower, it was to produce speed through smarter engineering. Progress wasn't easy. Early prototypes suffered from overheating. Cooling systems leaked. Components failed during testing. Higher power outputs placed enormous stress on internal parts that had never before experienced such forces. Every time an engine seized or overheated, months of work seemed to vanish. But instead of giving up, the engineers simply started again. Weeks became months. Months became years. Every solution uncovered another problem. Yet the failures never discouraged the team. Each breakdown revealed another weakness to eliminate. Slowly, the engine became stronger, more reliable, more powerful. The project remained hidden from public attention, but inside Rolls-Royce, the engineers knew they were working on something extraordinary. Then the world began changing faster than anyone expected. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within only a few years, Germany openly rejected many of the restrictions imposed after the First World War. Its military expanded rapidly. New aircraft appeared in growing numbers. Across Europe, the possibility of another war no longer seemed impossible. Suddenly, governments that had once hesitated to invest in aviation began searching desperately for modern military equipment. The British Air Ministry started looking for a new generation of fighters, capable of defending the nation against increasingly advanced enemy aircraft. Those fighters would require an entirely new engine, one capable of producing more power than anything Britain currently possessed. Without realising it, Rolls-Royce had already spent years building exactly what the country now needed. As development continued, the P-51 began delivering the performance its engineers had hoped for. Power climbed steadily. Reliability improved. Confidence inside Rolls-Royce grew. The experimental project had evolved into something much more important. It was no longer simply an engineering exercise. It was becoming Britain's best chance to keep pace with a rapidly rearming Europe. In keeping with Rolls-Royce tradition, the engine also received a new name. The company often named its aircraft engines after birds of prey. This one would be called the Merlin, a small falcon renowned for its speed, agility, and relentless hunting ability. It was an appropriate choice, because before long, the Merlin would power two new fighters that promised to redefine aerial combat. One came from Hawker, the other from Supermarine. Together, they would soon face the greatest test in Britain's history, and the fate of an entire nation would depend on whether one engine could deliver everything its designers had promised. By the late 1930s, the Rolls-Royce Merlin was no longer an experimental project. It had become Britain's most important aircraft engine. But becoming important didn't mean becoming perfect. Far from it. As engineers pushed the Merlin toward higher power outputs, new problems emerged almost every week. Crankshafts failed under enormous stress. Cooling systems struggled to keep temperatures under control. Superchargers needed constant refinement. An engine that performed beautifully during one test could fail completely during the next. Every extra horsepower came at a price. The Merlin wasn't being developed inside the comfort of peacetime. It was racing against a clock that Britain couldn't control. Across the English Channel, Germany was building one of the most powerful air forces the world had ever seen. There was no time for failure. Rolls-Royce engineers settled into an exhausting routine. Design, build, test, break, improve, repeat. Day and night, engines ran on test stands until components wore out or exploded. Every failure became another lesson. Every redesign pushed the Merlin one step closer to becoming the engine Britain desperately needed. The company wasn't chasing perfection. It was chasing reliability. Because an aircraft engine wasn't judged by how well it performed in a laboratory. It was judged by whether it brought its pilot home. One of the Merlin's greatest strengths was its supercharger. As an aircraft climbed higher, the air became thinner. Thinner air meant less oxygen reaching the engine. Less oxygen meant less power. Many engines lost performance rapidly at altitude. The Merlin was designed to fight that problem. Its supercharger compressed incoming air before it entered the cylinders, allowing the engine to maintain far more power high above the ground. That single feature would soon become one of Britain's greatest advantages. Future air battles weren't going to be fought only a few thousand feet above the countryside. They would be fought over 20,000 feet in the skies above southern England. And there, the Merlin would truly come alive. In 1938, the first production Merlin engines began entering service. They found their way into two entirely different aircraft. One was sturdy and conventional, the other sleek and revolutionary. The Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. Together, they represented Britain's future. The Hurricane formed the backbone of the Royal Air Force's fighter squadrons. It was rugged, dependable, and relatively easy to build. The Spitfire was faster, more graceful, designed for pure performance. Despite their differences, both depended on the same engine. If the Merlin failed, so would Britain's newest fighters. Then, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. Over the following months, German forces swept across Europe with astonishing speed. Poland fell. Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, then France. One by one, countries collapsed beneath the weight of the German war machine. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. The next invasion seemed inevitable. Before German troops could cross the English Channel, however, one obstacle had to be removed: the Royal Air Force. If the Luftwaffe gained control of the skies, Britain would be defenceless. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. Every day, hundreds of German bombers crossed the Channel. Escorted by Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, they attacked airfields, radar stations, factories, and cities. Many of the young pilots climbing into those cockpits were barely out of their teens. Few knew whether they would still be alive by the end of the day. These young pilots climbed into Hurricanes and Spitfires, aircraft powered almost entirely by Merlin engines. The pilots became famous. But behind every scramble, every interception, every victory, while the pilots received the glory, mechanics often worked through the night, repairing battle-damaged engines so the same aircraft could fly again at dawn. An aircraft without fuel was useless. An aircraft without ammunition couldn't fight. But an aircraft without an engine never left the ground. The Merlin became the beating heart of Britain's entire air defence. The pressure on Rolls-Royce was relentless. Every damaged aircraft required replacement engines. Every new fighter leaving the factory needed one. Production increased month after month. Workers laboured around the clock, yet demand always seemed to grow faster than supply. And even while factories produced engines at record speed, engineers continued improving the design. They couldn't afford to stand still. The Luftwaffe wasn't standing still either. Each new version of the Merlin delivered a little more power, a little more reliability, a little better performance. Small improvements that together made an enormous difference. One engineer, in particular, would change the Merlin forever. His name was Stanley Hooker. Unlike many of his colleagues, Hooker wasn't originally an aircraft engineer. He was a mathematician. When he joined Rolls-Royce, he turned his attention to one of the engine's most complicated components, the supercharger. Using advanced mathematical analysis, Hooker discovered that subtle changes to the airflow inside the supercharger could dramatically improve efficiency. The redesign seemed almost insignificant, yet the results were extraordinary. The Merlin produced noticeably more power without requiring a completely new engine. It was one of those rare engineering breakthroughs that appeared deceptively simple. Hooker's work gave the Merlin a second life, and it arrived at exactly the right moment. As the Battle of Britain raged through the summer and autumn of 1940, Merlin-powered fighters met the Luftwaffe day after day. The outcome depended on many factors: radar, ground controllers, pilot skill, aircraft production, determination. But the Merlin connected all of them. It gave Hurricanes the power to climb into combat. It gave Spitfires the speed to challenge German fighters. It gave Britain an engine capable of meeting the Luftwaffe on equal terms. By October, Germany abandoned its plans for immediate invasion. The Battle of Britain had been won. The Merlin had proven itself under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Most engines would have been remembered for that achievement alone. But for the Merlin, the greatest chapters of its story were still ahead. Because soon, this remarkable engine would power not just the aircraft defending Britain, but the bombers carrying the war back to Germany, the wooden wonder called the Mosquito, and even an American fighter that would become one of the greatest escort aircraft in history. By 1941, the Rolls-Royce Merlin had already helped Britain survive its darkest hour. For most engines, that would have been the defining achievement of an entire career. For the Merlin, it was only the beginning. As the war spread across Europe, North Africa, the Mediterranean and Asia, the Royal Air Force needed far more than fighters. It needed heavy bombers to strike Germany, fast reconnaissance aircraft to gather intelligence, night fighters to defend British cities, maritime patrol aircraft to hunt submarines. Every mission demanded something different. Yet remarkably, the same engine proved capable of doing them all. The Merlin wasn't simply becoming Britain's greatest aircraft engine, it was becoming the foundation of Britain's entire air war. One of the first aircraft to demonstrate that versatility was the Avro Lancaster. Powered by 4 Merlin engines, the Lancaster became the backbone of RAF Bomber Command. Together, those 4 engines produced well over 5,000 horsepower, allowing the bomber to carry enormous payloads deep into occupied Europe. Night after night, Lancaster crews crossed the North Sea toward Germany. Their targets were aircraft factories, oil refineries, railway yards, submarine pens, industrial cities that kept Hitler's war machine alive. Every mission depended on 4 Merlin engines working flawlessly for hours at a time. For 7 men sitting inside the Lancaster, those 4 engines weren't just machinery. They were the only thing standing between them and the North Sea hundreds of miles from home. If one engine failed, the bomber could often continue. Sometimes even 2 failed, and the crew still made it home. That reliability became one of the Lancaster's greatest strengths, and it reflected years of relentless engineering inside Rolls-Royce. Then came perhaps the most unlikely aircraft ever to carry the Merlin. The de Havilland Mosquito. Built largely from wood, many military officials believed it would never survive combat. An unarmed bomber made from plywood sounded almost absurd. But fitted with 2 Merlin engines, the Mosquito became one of the fastest operational aircraft of the entire war. It outran enemy fighters, photographed secret military installations, guided bomber formations over Germany, destroyed Gestapo headquarters, attacked prisons to free resistance fighters, intercepted German bombers at night. Few aircraft in history have served so many different roles so successfully. Once again, the Merlin had transformed an unconventional idea into a legendary weapon. The engine's influence didn't stop with Britain. Across the Atlantic, another aircraft was struggling to reach its full potential. The North American P-51 Mustang possessed one of the finest airframes ever designed. It was sleek, fast, aerodynamically efficient, but its original Allison engine lost power at high altitude, exactly where long-range escort fighters needed it most. The Mustang showed enormous promise, yet it wasn't the aircraft its designers believed it could become. British engineers proposed a bold experiment: replace the Allison with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, The result stunned everyone. The transformation was extraordinary. The Merlin gave the Mustang exceptional high-altitude performance while preserving its remarkable range. Almost overnight, a good fighter became one of the greatest escort fighters of the Second World War. Now, American bombers could be protected all the way to Berlin and back again. Success created a new problem. Demand for the Merlin exploded. Rolls-Royce factories worked day and night, yet they still couldn't build enough engines. The solution came from America. The Packard Motor Car Company received a license to manufacture the Merlin under Rolls-Royce specifications. This wasn't a simplified copy. It was the same engine, produced to the same exacting standards. Packard adapted its automotive manufacturing expertise to one of the most advanced aircraft engines in the world. Soon, Merlins were rolling off production lines on both sides of the Atlantic. British-built engines powered RAF aircraft. Packard-built Merlins powered thousands of American Mustangs. It became one of the greatest examples of Allied industrial cooperation during the war. The same engine now united two air forces fighting the same enemy. While production expanded, the engineers refused to stand still. Every new version of the Merlin delivered more power, better reliability, greater altitude performance. The Merlin 20, the Merlin 45, the Merlin 61. Each represented years of testing and refinement. One of the biggest breakthroughs came with the introduction of the two-stage, two-speed supercharger. It allowed the Merlin to maintain extraordinary performance at altitudes where many rival engines struggled. Instead of designing an entirely new engine every few years, Rolls-Royce continually improved the one it already had. The Merlin evolved alongside the war itself. Every improvement reached the front lines. Every additional horsepower gave Allied pilots another advantage. Germany produced outstanding aircraft engines of its own. The Daimler-Benz DB601 and later DB605 powered the Messerschmitt Bf 109. The Junkers Jumo 213 became one of the finest piston engines of the late war. Their engineers were every bit as talented. But engineering alone couldn't win the war. Factories were bombed. Raw materials became scarce. Fuel shortages grew worse with every passing month. Britain and the United States faced challenges of their own. Yet together, they continued producing Merlin engines in astonishing numbers. The Allies weren't simply building a remarkable engine, they were building enough of them to sustain a global air war. By 1945, more than 150,000 Merlin engines had been built. Factories in Britain and America produced them almost without pause. Every week they left assembly lines destined for Spitfires defending Britain, Lancasters crossing the North Sea, Mosquitos striking deep behind enemy lines, Mustangs escorting bomber formations all the way to Berlin. Few machines in history have served so many different aircraft so brilliantly. Yet what made the Merlin truly extraordinary wasn't the number of engines produced. It was what those engines made possible. Every Spitfire climbing to intercept the Luftwaffe, every Lancaster carrying its crew into the darkness over Germany, every Mosquito outrunning enemy fighters, every Mustang bringing American bombers safely home. Behind each mission, behind every victory, was the same unmistakable roar. By the end of the war, the Merlin wasn't simply powering airplanes, it was powering the entire Allied air campaign. It had become the invisible thread connecting nearly every major victory in the skies over Europe. And when the fighting finally ended, people would remember the aircraft. The Spitfire, the Lancaster, the Mosquito, the Mustang. But history would slowly come to realize that behind every one of those legends stood the same masterpiece of engineering. But the Merlin story didn't end when the guns fell silent, because the engine that won the war was about to face its greatest challenge yet, surviving peace. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the Rolls-Royce Merlin had accomplished something no one could have imagined when the project began more than a decade earlier. It hadn't simply powered one famous aircraft, it had powered an entire generation. From the desperate days of the Battle of Britain, to the bombing campaign over Germany, to long-range escort missions deep into the Reich, the Merlin had become the beating heart of Allied air power. More than 150,000 Merlin engines had been built by the end of the war, both in Britain by Rolls-Royce and in the United States by Packard. They powered fighters, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, night fighters, maritime patrol aircraft. Very few military engines in history have served so many different roles so successfully, and even fewer have influenced the outcome of a war on such an enormous scale. Perhaps the Merlin's greatest achievement wasn't its power, it was its ability to evolve. The first production, Merlins delivered just over 1,000 horsepower. By the war's final years, later variants produced well over 1,600 horsepower. Yet the basic architecture remained remarkably similar. Instead of throwing away the original design and starting over, Rolls-Royce engineers improved it piece by piece. Better superchargers, stronger internal components, improved cooling, more efficient fuel systems. Every improvement allowed the same engine to meet new challenges. It became a masterpiece not because it was perfect from the beginning, but because its designers never stopped making it better. The Merlin also represented something larger than engineering. It represented cooperation. Thousands of engineers refined its design. Factory workers assembled it. Mechanics maintained it under impossible conditions. Pilots trusted it with their lives. Factories in Britain and America worked together to produce it on a scale that would have seemed unimaginable only a few years earlier. Every Merlin engine became the product of countless hands. Its success wasn't built by one brilliant engineer alone. It was built by an entire industrial workforce, determined to stay one step ahead of the enemy. When peace finally returned, aviation entered a new era. Jet engines were transforming flight. Aircraft like the Gloucester Meteor and the de Havilland Vampire demonstrated that the future no longer belonged to piston engines. One by one, Merlin-powered military aircraft retired from frontline service. The age of the propeller fighter was coming to an end. Yet the Merlin refused to disappear. For years after the war, it continued powering civilian aircraft, transports, and racing planes. Restored Spitfires, Hurricanes, Mustangs, and Lancasters still fly today, because the Merlin continues to do exactly what it was designed to do. More than 80 years later, engineers are still maintaining and rebuilding these remarkable machines. Not because they have to, because they want to preserve one of history's greatest engineering achievements. Even today, the sound of a Merlin engine is instantly recognizable. A deep mechanical growl that rises into a sharp, unmistakable roar. For aviation enthusiasts, it's more than noise. It's history brought back to life. Every airshow where a Spitfire or Hurricane takes to the skies. Every Lancaster that makes a ceremonial fly past. Every restored Mustang climbing into the air carries with it the unmistakable voice of the Merlin. For some, that sound is a reminder of the machines they flew. For others, it is a tribute to the engineers, mechanics, and crews who never returned home. Few machines have left such a lasting emotional impact. Looking back, it's remarkable how uncertain the Merlin's future once seemed. It began as a private venture, an engine developed without a government contract. It suffered countless setbacks, overheating, mechanical failures, years of redesign. There were easier projects to pursue, safer investments to make. But Rolls-Royce kept going, because its engineers believed they weren't just building a better engine, they were building the future of aviation. History proved them right. The Merlin became the engine behind some of the greatest aircraft ever constructed. the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the Lancaster, the Mosquito, the P-51 Mustang. Each became legendary in its own way. Yet behind every one of them was the same extraordinary piece of engineering. Historians often ask which single weapon had the greatest influence on the Allied victory. Many historians would argue that engines like the Pratt & Whitney RT800 or Daimler-Benz DB605 were equally remarkable achievements. Yet few match the Merlin's versatility across so many aircraft types and roles. The Spitfire is always part of the conversation. So is the Lancaster, the Mustang, the Mosquito. Each deserves its place in history. But none of those aircraft could have achieved what they did without the engine that brought them to life. The Rolls-Royce Merlin didn't fight the war alone, but it connected nearly every major chapter of the Allied air campaign. It defended Britain when invasion seemed inevitable. It carried the war into the heart of Germany. It escorted bombers all the way to Berlin. It powered precision strikes that changed the course of battles. And in doing so, it proved that sometimes the most important weapon isn't the aircraft everyone remembers. It's the engine hidden beneath the cowling. An engine that started as an ambitious gamble and became one of the greatest engineering triumphs of the 20th century. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the aircraft, engineering breakthroughs, and untold stories that shaped World War II. And let me know in the comments which legendary aircraft, engine, or weapon should we cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.